Fox, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. In this brief keynote presentation, I'll really just set the scene, and a lot of this we already know as we have an interest in the forest and other land use sector. Really the significant mitigation potential from this sector, I'll refer to it as follow, if you don't mind, on removing the A, the agriculture part. Building on the previous 10M events, I'll then briefly outline some of the barriers that have been identified to realising this potential, and then some of the actions that have come forth to unlock the mitigation potential from follow sectors, which is highly significant. Really, I would like to provide a prelude to the country showcases for pre-2020 climate mitigation action to follow. So, a few facts that we all probably know, but as commonly cited, emissions from Afolu accounted for approximately 25% of global greenhouse gas emissions in 2010. Emissions from forestry contributed 10 to 12% of global emissions, or 5.4 to 5.8 gigatons of CO2 equivalent in 2010. Follow is often the dominant source of emissions in low-income countries with limited industrial bases, commonly generating more than 50% of national emissions. Further, in low-income countries, mitigation in follow sectors results in social, environmental, and governance benefits, contributing to Sustainable Development Goal 2, Zero Hunger, Sustainable Development Goal 6, Clean Water and Sanitation, SDG 13, Climate Action, and finally SDG 15, Life on the Land. REDD+, it's already been mentioned, is an example of mitigation action with multiple sustainable development benefits, and for which there is considerable momentum for pre-2020 climate mitigation action, as has been mentioned, and which has been affirmed by Article 5 of the Paris Agreement. Just to as an example, I'll mention the recently submitted REDD+ results for Brazil in the BUR REDD+ Technical Annex. Based on the forest reference emission level for deforestation in the Amazonian biome, Brazil measured emission reductions of just over 3 gigatons of carbon dioxide equivalent between 2011 to 2015. The BUR will now undergo the ICA process, but when you think about 3 gigatons of CO2 equivalent in comparison to global estimates in 2010, it is a significant mitigation action, which conveys well the potential of this sector. And the potential of follow is also recognised by member countries. 100 countries directly mention mitigation in follow in their NDCs. In fact, a recent analysis of NDCs published in Nature indicates that countries expect follow to provide a quarter of the entire pledged mitigation efforts up to 2030. So given the significant mitigation potential, it is timely and in fact urgent that we examine some of the barriers and identify pathways to translate this potential into action. Despite the significant potential for mitigation in follow, there are barriers to implementation due to the complexity of drivers of land use and land use change. These barriers are well summarised in the synthesis report of the previous 10M events and include socioeconomic barriers, such as the lack of sufficient upfront finance to cover transaction and monitoring costs, the long implementation timeframes that require significant resource allocations that is challenging for both donors and countries. Furthermore, long time periods are required to overcome social resistance, ensure engagement of Indigenous people, and incorporate diverse value systems. Indeed, direct action is complicated by the multiple objectives influencing the drivers of land use and land use change from different economic sectors and policy contexts, such as the priority in many developing countries, such as food security and development. Secondly, there are environmental barriers, such as the diversity of environmental conditions, which renders replication and scaling up of mitigation actions difficult. The depletion and degradation of land resources reduces the availability of productive land and then influences land use decision-making in an often negative way. Thirdly, there are institutional barriers, such as inadequate subnational and cross-sectoral integration. Coordination is required for national, subnational, and local implementation. Further, because of the complex policy drivers on forestry and other land uses, cross-sectoral integration is necessary to create an enabling environment for implementation. Finally, there are technological barriers such as the complexity of methods for measurement, reporting and verification, and capacity barriers in implementing these methods. As FAO, we know well the challenge of MRV knowledge and capacity transfer to partner countries in an activity in which we are deeply engaged. So although not insurmountable, in each individual context or country, there will be an intersection of barriers across socioeconomic, environmental, institutional, and technological factors that may result in implementation difficulties and hinder replication and scaling up. Finally, what have we learned from previous 10M events? We don't want to reinvent the wheel. The high potential actions identified in previous 10M events include REDD+, reducing deforestation, improved forest management, afforestation and reforestation. For these actions to be successful, there needs to be an enabling environment. And there are usually a set of common factors that are key to this enabling environment, which I'll briefly mention here. There is a need for integrated approaches to land use that balance agricultural needs for production and food security and the sustainable management and conservation of forests. There needs to be clear linkages between mitigation actions and social, environmental and governance-related development objectives that covers a spectrum of SDGs. There is a need for commitment from high levels of government, clear mandates and the inclusion and participation of cross-sectoral stakeholders for successful actions. It is necessary for sufficient financial support tailored to meet contextual needs of national and local circumstances. There is a need for adequate governance through strengthened institutional arrangements and legal and regulatory frameworks. Finally, the diversity of local priorities and solutions needs to be embraced rather than being a barrier to implementation and action. On this optimistic note, I pass to the showcase presentations from the countries to help us identify scalable and replicable climate mitigation actions. I thank you.
Thank you, Julian. Now we are going to have a set of presentations, which will be followed by one, maximum 2 questions for clarification each, and then we will engage into a panel discussion. So I would like to invite the presenters. You will have the opportunity later on after the presentations and the short panel discussion to engage into questions, answering the questions yourself that are being asked to the panel or asking further questions. So if we are sort of confined to the time that is being given, we will have more time for discussion. So I will encourage the presenters to stick to the time. So we have the first presenter, which is Estefanía Ardila Robles from Colombia. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Maria and everyone. And first of all, I would like to thank you all for this kind invitation, which is very important for Colombia to share a little bit of our work regarding REDD+, and specifically the activity of reducing deforestation. With that being said, I would like to start by showing you a little bit of the numbers, deforestation numbers in Colombia, and they tell a story. And although we have experienced a steep decline in deforestation over the last 2 decades or so, current rates are by no means desirable to us. And the reason is that those deforestation hotspots overlap with areas which are high in biodiversity, in cultural values, areas which are important to local communities. They have to do also with water regulation. So there are so many benefits besides carbon, of course, that are related to this issue of deforestation. So to us, the ambition has to go higher, and that is why we have set ourselves a goal to reduce deforestation to 90,000 hectares by next year, actually 2018, and then moving on to even higher, moving the bar a little bit higher for 2020 and 2030, with the aim of reducing at a minimum and eliminating deforestation by 2030. So that's the overall aspiration, and that's why I'm saying that although there has been some success, this is not the end of the road. This is only a step towards something much bigger. So I wanted to address also those strategic working areas that we have set from the policy perspective on how to move forward and how to achieve those goals we have proposed as a country. First of all, it's a shared vision of forests, and this is acknowledging that forests are just not an isolated element of nature which is out there, but it's very much related to, as I mentioned, culture, to people, to many actors, to productive sectors. So these actors, these key stakeholders, you have to engage with them in ways that are useful in order to make deforestation control or reducing deforestation to have make sense for everyone. Then we have a component on land use planning, land zoning. This is very important for Colombia. So establishing clear rules regarding the management, the uses of different areas, depending on their characteristics. We have a very important work on protected areas, expanding them, expanding also their diversity in terms of the representativeness of ecosystems. There is also an important component, which I will mention later, on monitoring, prevention, and control, and how this is a tool and is the base and a key instrument to ensure that there is control and that we actually know what we're doing in terms of reducing deforestation. And fourth, a component on institutional arrangements, on the provision of finance, on setting the instruments in place to finance all these actions, which are not easy, and building capacity, not only in the institutions that are in charge of managing this from the policy perspective, but all the actors that are engaged in this action against deforestation. So just to go a bit into detail on the monitoring perspective, which is my background. I work for the Forest and Carbon Monitoring System in Colombia. I just wanted to highlight that we have managed to consolidate a robust monitoring system, which has already produced results, which has already undergone all the processes under the convention for REDD+ with success. However, the key for us at the moment is work and intensify work on creating the link between a functional institutional arrangement to exert control on the ground and that monitoring system. So this, just to make general comments, is composed by an institutional arrangement sort of top-down with very specific results on the ground on controlling deforestation events. So this is our challenge right now. We're working on this, producing the first results. So this is the priority at the moment. And of course, just to wrap up, I wanted to touch on the role that REDD+ has had in this big puzzle we have put together in order to take all these actions forward. To us, REDD has come as in the form of results-based payments, of course, facilitated by some of our key partner countries, and also through programs which have addressed specifically and very, very importantly, the readiness and the preparation phase of implementing REDD. So this, in general, has been, among other instruments, a key instrument to provide finance, technical support to these actions I outlined before regarding monitoring, regarding land use planning, regarding creating those institutional arrangements and facilitating participation, broad participation by all the actors which are involved in this overarching strategy against deforestation. So yeah, just to wrap up, those are my general ideas. I don't know if there are any questions from the floor or comments.
Thank you very much. There is any burning question from the floor for clarification of the presentation of Estefania? Otherwise, we move to the next presentation. Yeah, please identify yourself.
Andrei Lalikin with Friends of Siberian Forest and Global Forest Coalition. You told that Colombia will halt deforestation in 2030, according to your plan. But there is SDG 15.2 that said that countries should halt deforestation in 2020. So why it is such discrepancy, and what steps will Colombian government will make to halt deforestation in the country? Thank you.
Shall we take?
Okay.
Yeah, there is any other one, so we take it. We take it at once. No, okay. So please, Stephanie.
Okay, thank you for that question. I think it's a very important one. Just to elaborate a little bit more on those targets, I do believe that the ambition is quite high. The plan is to reduce to zero net deforestation in the Amazon region of Colombia. That's by 2020. And that region in Colombia comprises the largest amount of forests in the country. So just achieving that would be actually a monumental target. So this is the ambition. And then to 2030, the ambition is to halt it for the rest of the country. But as I just mentioned, the Amazon comprises the largest part and is also the area in which most of the deforestation has occurred historically and is occurring now. So that's like the big step is to happen in the next following years.
Thank you, Stefania. So I think we can pass now to the next presentation, which is going to be provided by Mrs. Sally Box, the Director of International Negotiations from the Australian Government Department. Please give yourself 6 minutes.
Hi everybody. Thanks very much for the invitation. It's a real pleasure to share Australia's experiences with mitigation action in the land sector. The land sector is really central to Australia's mitigation policy. Our continent takes up, a full 5% of the world's total land area. 16% of Australia is forest, around 125 million hectares. And 61% of Australia's land mass is given over to agriculture. So it makes sense that the land sector actions make up a significant element of our abatement policy suite. So the centrepiece of Australia's abatement policy is the Emissions Reduction Fund. So this fund incentivises emission reductions across the Australian economy through a reverse auction mechanism, in which the government contracts emissions reductions, which are credited according to particular methods. It's an economy-wide fund and it's a voluntary scheme, so participation is entirely voluntary. And all the emissions reduction fund projects are conducted in accordance with methods. And these methods must comply with environmental integrity standards, which are embedded in legislation to make sure that the abatement's additional, to make sure that it's measurable, verifiable, that it's evidence-based and material and is eligible to be counted towards Australia's climate change targets. So the fund actually has a very significant focus on the land sector. The fund features 18 land sector related methods involving planting trees or avoiding clearing, improving management of savanna fires, and in agriculture, increasing carbon in the soil of grazing lands, improving herd management practices, and capturing and destroying methane from some of our intensive livestock industries. These projects have multiple benefits for participants, including increased productivity, employment opportunities, as well as environmental benefits such as improved water quality, reduced salinity, and reduced erosion. So the fund's first auction took place in April 2015. We've had 5 auctions altogether, and so far the fund's contracted 189 million tonnes of abatement, and with around 80% of this actually coming from the land sector. So our landholders have been a great beneficiary of this fund. So today I thought I'd just briefly cover 2 case studies from the Emission Reduction Fund's more than 400 projects contracted to date. And I think both of these case studies show how the fund both incentivises land sector abatement, but also provides important co-benefits for landholders, the environment and communities. So first I'll mention a couple of projects to regenerate native vegetation along Queensland's coast, including adjacent to the iconic Great Barrier Reef, by changing land management practices. These projects will generate more than 20 million tonnes of abatement over the next 10 years. The projects aim to protect approximately 500,000 hectares of native forest and woodlands through the catchments of the Great Barrier Reef by either halting, clearing or assisting ecosystem restoration. So in addition to the sort of significant volumes of carbon abatement, these projects are delivering other critical environmental benefits to Queensland. So they're restoring and protecting high-value ecosystems with the aim of building that resilience at the landscape level. And the projects are in areas that will benefit Queensland's freshwater and marine health, with a particular focus on the Great Barrier Reef. Restoring these ecosystems will reduce nutrient, pesticide and sediment content in the runoff from land-based activities, including agriculture. And this is anticipated to improve water quality in the Great Barrier Reef inshore areas. So I just wanted to show this as an example of an emissions reduction project that's also achieving those other benefits. Oops. Turned it off.
The big screen is not working, but
Can anybody see it? No. I'll let someone fix that and I'll keep talking. So I guess the next, I'll move it along. Here we go. So in the north of Australia, landholders are combining traditional knowledge with the latest science to manage the impact of savanna fires. So under this method, fire management's carried out with the intention of increasing the area burnt by cooler, lower intensity early dry season fires, so that less area is burnt in the late dry season fires. So this practice of early dry season burning reduces methane and nitrous oxide emissions by lowering the frequency of late dry season bushfires that would otherwise produce substantial greenhouse gas emissions. These late season wildfires produce about twice as much carbon emissions as controlled burning early in the dry season. So at Fish River in the Northern Territory, about 70% of the savanna in the project area has historically been burnt by late season fires. But implementing these traditional early dry season practices through the Emissions Reduction Fund has actually reduced this area to less than 5%. So, and this project's having a wide range of benefits. Savanna burning in this way is a traditional Indigenous practice. So not only are there mitigation benefits, but also cultural benefits. And the project's helping to employ Indigenous people to stay on their traditional land. So there's really strong cultural benefits. And there's also significant biodiversity benefits as savanna burning helps to diversify grasslands. So at Fish River, we're seeing biodiversity improve, feral animals are being more effectively controlled, and we're getting threatened species conservation measures in place as well. So in terms of next steps, as I've said, these are just two of the 400 ERF projects that together are delivering 189 million tonnes of abatement, and there'll be more to come with further auctions. In terms of next steps, I think we will continue to explore methods for sourcing least cost abatement from across the economy, and also for finding methods that produce some of those co-benefits. So as part of this, we're scoping the potential for our coastal blue carbon ecosystem to achieve mitigation goals. We're also looking at other methods in the savannas to not only credit the emissions reductions, but also to credit the increased carbon sequestration because of the increase in the sort of organic matter stored in the soil as a result of the change in these burning practices. So I guess to wrap up, I'm getting the wrap up, the land sector will continue to have an important role in Australia's abatement policy, and we're continuing to develop new methods for sourcing abatement that not only has carbon benefits, but also these multiple benefits for communities and the environment. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Again, is there any burning question for Australia? Sure. Please identify yourself.
Thank you for the presenters for the presentation. So I would like to ask Australia. So you mentioned about the managing the savanna fires and you inclusive of the Indigenous people in the programs. So can you share with all of us on what is the challenges of in engaging these Indigenous people to do such important mitigation actions? Thank you.
Thanks very much for your question. This is just a really, I guess, wonderful story. If we found that the Indigenous communities were involved in this process right from the beginning, I was really fortunate to be involved in the development of this method several years ago, and it really was a joined up effort from the beginning between the local Indigenous communities in the Northern Territory and also in Western Australia, as well as with researchers from our Charles Darwin University and our National Science Organisation, really working together to work out how we could develop this. So what's been interesting is that actually the Indigenous organisations who are involved in some of these early projects have taken very strong ownership of this themselves, and the Kimberley Land Council, who are not involved in this Fish River project but in other savanna birding projects, are really interested in how they can help sort of other Indigenous communities potentially participate in these sorts of activities. And members of the Kimberley Land Council they were at COP in Marrakesh and have been here looking at how they can sort of, I guess, make these sort of projects more widely distributed. So I guess we've found it a very collaborative initiative where there has been sort of a genuine joint ownership of these sort of projects, and we've, as a government, held several workshops in other parts of Australia with the local Indigenous communities and with the scientists to look at whether we can, I guess, expand these sort of projects to other environments. So it's been a very positive experience for us.
Thank you very much. Now we will move to Dr. Ivo Noor. So, Ivo, can you go ahead, please?
Thank you, Maria. Good afternoon, colleague. At this opportunity, I would like to share about the RAD Plus development in Indonesia, and especially for the last 2 years, we have done significant transformation in managing our peatland. So we, in this presentation, I try to connect the RAD Plus with the peatland management in Indonesia. So, for us, area in Indonesia covering about 60% of our country land area, about 128.9 million hectares. And we have also forest outside forest area. Among the natural forests that we have in 1990, we used 113.2 million hectares as the basis for constructed the FREL last 2 years. We include deforestation and forest degradation, also peat decomposition, but we didn't include peat fire because of very high uncertainty. But we included in our panel update report. So if the public want to know the national status of our greenhouse gas emission from land sector, could see that. We found the deforestation rate from 1990 to 2012 of 0.9 million hectare per year, and with about 0.5 million hectare of forest degradation. To see how important of peatland in our RAD Plus area, about 96 million hectare of our forest RAD Plus area. They located in mineral soil, about 85.4 million hectare, and 11.144 million hectare in the peatland. We have a total peatland area of about 14.9 million hectare. But if we include the peatland hydrological area, that cover about 24.6 million hectare. We have developed a RAD Plus architecture from National Strategy Forest Reference Emissions Level, National Forest Monitoring System, and also a safeguard information system in place. Our forest reference emissions level already submitted to the UNFCCC Secretariat and also completed the technical assessment there. We have TETRAD Plus architecture in place. However, we have not been able to reach phase 3 with the result-based payment there. We have existing bilateral and multilateral support that towards result-based payment. First, bilateral Indonesia-Norway cooperation. We work at the national level, and at the moment we need to agree on institutional, especially for funding institution and a methodological aspect. We have already at the national level, but both Norway and Indonesia try to see how far we could include the emission from pit fire in our FRAL construction. We have FCPF carbon fund working at the provincial level in East Kalimantan. There is still some legal aspect that we need to settle down. And we have also biocarbon fund working at Jambi province. This is still at the design stage. We have FIP program has been approved for many years, but has not been started. Yes, this is the last slide, the challenges. The first challenge is meeting institutional and legal as well as methodological requirement associated with the support of payment for results. More support available for readiness, but the lack of support for phase 2, that is very important in the case for Indonesia to be able to move for the phase 3 implementation where payment for result is involved. Thank you, colleagues. Yeah.
Thank you, Ibu. Is a question from the floor to Indonesia? No, I don't see any hands. So let's move to the next presentation, which is going to be provided by Valérie Dermont from France. Here. Yeah.
Thank you. I will focus on 2 examples. Thank you. Of mitigation actions, one in agroforestry and one in forestry. It's in the middle of 2 slides. Ah merde.
Maybe they can pass for you, so that you say next slide, and
Okay.
that will help.
Okay,
Can this be done?
Yeah, it will be better.
Okay.
So, next slide. In France, we have several models of agroforestry. For example, we have bocage, which is mixed fields and hedges. We have silvopasture. We have pré verger, which are orchards and pasture. And overseas, we have many other models. For example, shifting agriculture, understory vanilla. Agroforestry is really enhanced in France. It's inside the French agroecology project. So we have a national agroforestry plan, which is coordinated by the ministry. And we have the development of a research development network. And we support the collective work of farmers with their projects. Next slide. And then I would like to focus on one case of agroforestry, which is alley cropping. So for this kind of agroforestry, we have a small surface in France. We have only 5,000 to 10,000 hectares in the country. It's not much, but it's increasing rapidly now because it took some time to to coordinate everything and to get used to this new way of doing. And we have subsidies from the European agriculture policy for this process, which are managed by the region. And we have a specialized structure to support this, including NGOs, civil society, natural parks, agriculture advisors, etc. And it's really a mitigation action because it was measured. It made 330 kilogram CO2 by hectare and by year in an experiment of 20 years with walnut and crop fields. And it also contributes, of course, to the objectives of the CAP per meal initiative, which are food security, resilience, and mitigation. Next slide. Then I'll focus a little bit on forest. In France, we have 31% of the surface in forest, which is at 35% owned by the private sector, which is a bit more complicated to drive. And this is an example. Next slide, please. This is a SylvAct project. Is an example of a project enhanced locally. So the first experiment took place in 2010, and it was really launched after the experiment last year. So it's quite new, and it's an incentivize of forest carbon, but it needs to be a collective project. And it's a result-based payment. So the project leader have to demonstrate the mitigation and then biodiversity and socio-economic benefits. And to be able to demonstrate it and to give some advice, there was a technical work involving research, NGO, etc. And so it's put in place in only one region in France, and it was initiated by a structure named COFOR, which is a linkage between the towns and region having forest in France. And so you can see all the benefits that we are waiting from this project. For example, climate, water, rural economy, biodiversity, renewable energy, landscape, air quality, etc. Next slide. And for this project, to have the subsidy, it has to be, of course, additional. So it's not possible to only put in place mandatory actions. The forests have to be certified. There are on-the-ground checks. And the money, the subsidy, comes from both private and public funds. And the practice have to be put in place at least for 10 years. And there are multiple stakeholders. And I just give you 3 examples of practice as forest management. Is to harvest at the silvicultural optimum, to mix species and ages of trees, and to reduce the density of trees per hectare. Thank you.
Thank you very much. There is any question for Franz? Yes, please.
Thank you very much. Sorry. Thank you very much, Valerie, for your presentation. It is very interesting. I had a question on, I saw you estimate very interesting potential for soil organic carbon sequestration in those, what you call alley cropping. Could you expand on how you monitor soil organic carbon, as it is one of the challenges that we usually face when we think on soil organic carbon projects? So what methodologies you use and how do you implement it on the ground?
Thank you for this interesting question. This experiment was made by our French Agronomy Research Institute over 20 years, and unfortunately, I don't really know how they did. I'm not concretely involved in this project, but I can answer you later if you want. Sorry.
Thank you very much. We are going to move now to the next presentation by Dr. Daniel Murriaso, and you're going to illustrate us on more scientific aspects, I suppose.
Thank you very much, Maria. This morning we learned about agriculture and mitigation. Julian has mentioned about the F of the AFOLU. So to A and F, I slashed both of them. Now I'm talking about the OLU, the other land use. So by definition in the IPCC guideline, wetland has been separated in terms of accounting and assessment, inventory, and countries made aware about that. And not many are ready to pick up. It's not mandatory yet, but the guideline is already on the table. So what I'm trying to share with the audience today is to see the possibility of including wetlands for mitigation. So you can see here the potential of wetland, namely mangrove and tropical, especially in the tropical as well as subtropical peatland. There are huge carbon storage there, and it is highly potential for mitigation. But at the same time, this ecosystem are very much threatened. The rate of deforestation and degradation, drainage, etc., is huge. Yesterday, we had a GPI session talking about peatland all over the place, and it's been recorded so well that drainage has been the main challenge for mitigation as well as protection of wetland. But again, this ecosystem is very prolific in terms of sequestering and keeping carbon there, with a burial rate of more than 20 times than terrestrial forests. This is a brand new product that we produced last week, and I just got a notification from the publisher, the Global Change Biology, that the paper is online today, so people can access this, that we discovered more than 3 times wetland globally, and in Latin America proved to be the largest wetland and peatland. So it's time now to look at this globally, but this tool can be used at national level. People can download the data, so we put the map online, and can be very interactive, and people can download the tiles and use it for national planning. So we encourage you to use this map to look at where potential wetland can be used at national level, and then play around with the emission factors, with the activities that you can play around with the local community, with private sectors, etc. So the map is online, so you can use it, and it's very interactive. So scientifically speaking, wetland has been understood quite well these days, and we will produce more and more, another organization producing more and more information on wetland. And the reporting system is also very much guided. So as I mentioned earlier, the drained inland organic soil, including peatland and rewetted peatland, is already there. So countries can use this to mobilize the potential of wetland for climate change mitigation. And also, so speak to mention about the coastal wetland. Mangrove is covering, I think it includes 20 plus countries now, with potential livelihood component on it. People asking about involving local people. Livelihood component for aquaculture is very attractive for bundling mitigation actions and local community involvement. So to wrap up, this exercise has been started 3 years ago this very SAPSTA invited the scientific community to look at high carbon reservoir, including wetland, and we, a group of scientists, tried to propose to look at wetland, peatland, mangrove, salt marsh, ecosystem, the boreal ecosystem in the temperate zone to be part of the exercise. And I think it's flying now. It was only an information document, SAPSTA/ENF. It's no kind of binding kind of mechanism to do that. But the report is there, and I think science now is mature to get attention and be used. So as far as best practice is concerned, we follow this story up and trying to work with the local community. If you look at picture like this, restoring degraded mangrove is not necessarily attended or followed up by planting. It can be improving the hydrology of that kind of ecosystem and then let the nature do the rest. And we provided with the guidelines how to do that. So that's, again, another document that can be used by countries. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Daniel. Is any question for Daniel on her presentation? No, I don't see any hands, so let's move to the next one with Mrs. Kate Dooley from the Rainforest Foundation of Norway.
Thank you very much. So I'm speaking on behalf of the ENGO, the Environmental NGO constituency, and I don't have a presentation. I'd just like to make some brief comments to wrap up. The first would be that as we've seen from a lot of these presentations here, the contribution of forests and other land uses to climate mitigation is quite significant, particularly in terms of the protection and restoration of terrestrial carbon stocks can make a really significant contribution to the 1.5, but well below 2 and 1.5 degree targets we have in the Paris Agreement, if these actions are additional to actions in all other economic sectors where emission reductions also need to happen. So very interesting to see from these presentations focus on wetlands and different forest types in different regions of the world, because the potential really is global. What I'd like to mostly talk about are some lessons from REDD as an example of one mechanism in the land sector that we have seen some progress in so far, and that is also a good example of how forest action in protecting forests can deliver multiple benefits and can really contribute to sustainable development. So I think it's interesting to remember right back to the start of REDD negotiations, the start of the concept of REDD, and how that led us to a point where REDD was established as a phased approach to forest protection. So we have the 3-phased approach, and this really builds on the need for and importance of forest governance reform in countries as a first step to reducing deforestation. So we've heard from some countries here about how this has been focused on in terms of the importance of participation, of legal and regulatory reform, building forest monitoring institutions, and safeguard information systems as agreed in the Cancun safeguards for REDD+. I think what's a really important lesson from this as we look at where REDD is now is that this is still, in a lot of countries, this is still where action is focusing in what's known as phase 1 and 2 of REDD, on this governance reform, on the institution building. The situation at the moment, particularly with the different multilateral funds for REDD, so we have the Carbon Fund paying for results-based REDD. The Green Carbon Fund is just in the process of setting up a payment mechanism for results finance for results-based REDD. And there are several multilateral and bilateral funding arrangements, some of which are focused on readiness phases and some of which are more focused on results. Most of these financing mechanisms have an issue with very slow disbursement, as well as the fact that not many countries yet have achieved results on REDD. So it was, as we heard at the start, we have 25 countries submitting forest reference levels, which is fantastic and shows the work being done in developing countries. But only one country, Brazil, has actually completed this process and has information in the REDD Information Hub. And so far, no country has actually, neither the Carbon Fund or the GCF, which hasn't established the mechanisms yet, have dispersed payments for results-based REDD. Now, this is generally taken as bad news, as an indication that REDD is going poorly and hence is a failure, and maybe we need to start again and look at a different way of protecting forests. I think actually the opposite is true in some ways. Whilst we do need to streamline and speed up the disbursement mechanisms in these funds, the wealth of experience across a range of countries involved in REDD shows that they are really engaging in the process of REDD. What was really the theory of change of REDD was this three-phase step, and beginning with governance reform, looking to institution building, and countries are seriously engaging and are in those stages. So I think it's not surprising. I mean, what we're hearing a lot of now in terms of the aim of the financial institutions is transformational reform and paradigm shift. Now, these are big words, and I think what they actually point to is the need for very deep change in country, not fast change. And so the key lessons I draw from the moment where we are now in terms of REDD finance and success on REDD would be that transformational change actually requires strong country ownership. And that's what the initial phases of REDD in terms of governance and institutional building are about. The second one would be that we need to move beyond, in terms of forest protection and reducing and restoring terrestrial carbon stocks and forests and other ecosystems, we need to move beyond just focusing on the forest sector. So the drivers that actually drive deforestation and land use change emanate from agriculture, from commodity supply chains. So the country ownership of the forest sector is not enough. We actually need to look at international commodity supply chains, agriculture and consumption. So that's a big challenge for the international community. And the final one is that sources of finance for REDD, whilst they need to be scaled up, essentially we need to scale up what we currently have now on the table. We have donor funding, we have public finance for REDD, and this is the sort of finance that can be directly channeled into the different phases of REDD that countries are at. So it's very important that finance for REDD remains available across, so that there's regional balance in disbursement of REDD finance, and that there's balance across the different stages where countries are at. So if the focus was all to shift to results-based finance, this is going to come at the cost of countries who need more time for institutional reform, and ultimately at the cost of a sort of a more globally successful move towards reducing deforestation. So scaled up public finance, but balance in how that's dispersed geographically and across REDD type initiatives. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Is there any question for? No? Well, now is moving to asking one question per panelist, and I want the panelists to be very. Oh, I'm sorry, Esteban, I forgot you. No. I think indeed this is one of the most important presentations. So, so yes, please go ahead.
Oh, thank you, Maria. I think that I got 1 more minute for this.
Yeah, for sure.
Thank you very much. What's the next slide, please? Oh, okay. All right, this one? The right one. The right one. Yes.
It's not working?
Okay, it's not going well, eh? Okay. Thank you very much, Maria. And I just want to focus on indigenous people's rights and their participation within the UN FCCC. The first slide, I want to focus that the importance that we have with our unique relationship with our lands and forests. Indigenous peoples have been and continue to be the primary guardians of nature, not only for forests, but of the entirety, which includes land, forest, trees, food, medicine, livelihoods, and knowledge. The source of life for us. For generations, indigenous peoples have managed to utilize forest resources in a sustainable manner. Indigenous peoples have always regarded forests as not simple resources to be exploited, but as the source of life, an integral part of our life and lifestyles. Forests have not only provide shelter and food to indigenous people. They also form the basis of many cultures and have various spiritual and cultural values for us that cannot be expressed in monetary values. Any mechanisms, initiatives without due respect for our rights can be destructive to us, our existence and survival as indigenous peoples. We have made these statements at all possible occasions, national as well as international, to which we kindly refer you again. It is for this reason that indigenous peoples should play a major role in all discussion related to forests. We are right holders in these discussions, not just stakeholders. Next one. I think that when need to get back, just yeah. We believe that indigenous peoples bring experience from the field, from the grassroots level, and the experience of the local knowledge. I think that our participation is important. For this reason, all activities should acknowledge and build upon the positive contribution of indigenous traditional knowledge towards sustainable forest management. Indigenous peoples recalls that the preamble of UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples recognize respect for indigenous knowledge and its contribution to proper management of the environment, including forest and land use. Okay, next one. The United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People actively seeks to protect the rights of indigenous peoples and recognize indigenous peoples' collective rights over their lands, territories, and natural resources. Further, the principle of free and informed consent, as included in the declaration, is an important norm that will help to protect the environment. The United Nations agencies should adopt the declaration in order to contribute to the protection of the environment, especially the forest. The denial of one human right, such as the right to land and means of subsistence, particularly for indigenous people, is the denial of human rights, including the rights to culture, development, identity, and survival. The collective right to life as peoples. Our traditional knowledge is critical to that identity and survival. Next, please. This way, I think that the United Nations agencies have the opportunity to work together with indigenous peoples' organizations, especially the communities. In case of COICA, which is Amazon Basin Indigenous Organization Coordinator in South America, they found an alternative RED initiative as an indigenous RED initiative, which is more focused on human rights basis approach. So that's very important for us. So is indigenous peoples are feel more part of this project, of this initiative, than bringing a packet from other side of the world. And I would like to finish with my my slides recommending that indigenous people recommend that full and effective participation of indigenous peoples within all climate change negotiations, policies, proposals, projects, and programs at all levels, beginning with the inclusion of indigenous people within working groups, expert meetings, steering committees, and all other policy and decision-making bodies. UNFCCC should ensure that any mechanisms, initiatives are designed and implemented with full respect for the rights of indigenous peoples, including our rights to our territorial lands, the right of free, prior, and informed consent, and the right to fully enact on our responsibilities toward our forest land and resources upon recognition of our rights. Thank you.
Thank you, Estebancio, and apologies again. I think your message has been so strong that I don't think there's any question about it. So let's move ahead with the panel. We have 25 minutes left. So I would like to appeal to the short answers to the questions to the panelists so that we have time for the floor to interact later. I will start with the Indonesia and Colombia. I mean, I will ask Ibu Nur, if you can tell us what are being the constraints, the financial constraints that you are facing in terms of, first of all, transitioning from readiness to the second phase, and then to materialize the results. I think you already been pointing out something in your presentation, but it will be very nice to understand better where you stand and what is your major challenge and concern at the moment?
Thank you, Maria. To be able to deliver results for payment, we need to create the enabling condition, including addressing the drivers of deforestation and forest degradation. We need a wide range of activities, policy approaches to address this issue. The challenge we are facing now that many support for readiness that already finished or completed, and we are moving in phase 2 that we need to address all of those issues to enable us to move to phase 3. So insufficient financial support to be used to address the issues in phase 2. This is the challenge that we have. This is including in addressing deforestation and forest degradation. This includes a lot of policy intervention that involve private sector, communities, local governments, that we cannot use the domestic budget to address all of these issues. Thank you.
Now we move to Stefania. I mean, you've been showing results and you've been measuring them. So my question now is, what are the challenges and how you overcome in order to show progress in a credible way?
Thank you. Well, there is a list, but only to touch on key issues. I'd like to highlight, for instance, some of the gaps we still have from the point of view of monitoring, and how once you step up the ladder, it gets harder and harder to actually improve, and more costly too. That is the case, for instance, for degradation. This is something we have been working on very hard over the last years. However, because there are science barriers, we still do not have these data sets we need in order to show progress or what is happening in terms of forest degradation. So we are able to speak now about deforestation, but forest degradation is still something that we need to explore further. And of course, it's tightly related to research capacity rather than technological barriers, which are important, but it is related to some certain science barriers. That is a key point I'd like to highlight. And the other thing, it's sort of related in order to reflect more clearly that relationship and more robustly and transparently that relationship between the forest conversion and greenhouse gas emissions and removals. It is important to further develop our data, our national data, specific data. And this, again, requires a lot of research at the national level. We are from countries which not have a long tradition of research. So there are certain bottom line issues that, of course, require further support from the financial, technical standpoint, but also from the scientific and the capacity and the means we have to develop now and be creative in order to exchange, for instance, with other countries who have already been working on this and have more experience than us. So yeah, the key word for me at this point would be science and furthering science at the country level in order to improve the credibility of monitoring.
Thank you very much. And now we move to the ones that are supposed to have more capacity. So my next question is for France, for Valérie. You have been explaining how you're deploying your mitigation actions in France, and my question is how you've been overcoming these institutional barriers and how you've been planning and implementing these actions on the ground, and what have been the sort of key messages that you want to convey to others for that.
Thank you. So it's true that we have some institutional barriers. We have also some some cross-sectorial integration focus, and also it's good to have in mind the linkage we have to make between the topics, for example, water, biodiversity, mitigation and adaptation, natural risk management, because it's all linked. It's just the point where we are in France now. We are trying to cross all of this to work at national and subnational level. And I could give some examples. For example, we have watershed management in some basins where we have all the stakeholders together. We try to cross also the research, development, the agricultural advisory, the teaching, the awareness of public. We try to mix all together because now we want to have a global management of topics.
Thank you very much. Now we move to Australia. You have been showing a very nice domestic means for incentivize your mitigation actions, which seems to be a central topic for you. Can you elaborate a little bit more on what have been the key challenges that you've been focusing and where you will recommend others that they will need to focus to start with?
Absolutely. I guess some of the challenges that we face are similar to others. How do you get that cross-sectoral integration? I guess we sort of worked hard in designing the Emissions Reduction Fund to ensure that the incentivisation of mitigation in one area didn't have adverse impacts on other sectors. So we have rules in place to make sure that revegetation projects, for example, don't have adverse impacts on prime agricultural land. So for the farm forestry and plantations methods, there are like rainfall level restrictions for plantings to make sure that mitigation activities complement rather than compete with prime agricultural land. So some of those cross-sectoral challenges. I guess we also, in Australia, this ERF it's a national program, but we're a federation of states and territories, and so integration with the sub-national governments is challenging as well, in that responsibility for land use management is really the responsibility of the states and territories in Australia. So I guess in designing our emissions reduction fund, I'm coming back to that, I guess, because it was the focus of my presentation. We have, I think, like Valerie was saying, strong sort of additionality rules to make sure that stakeholders aren't getting credits for things that they're required to do under state or territory laws. And for example, we only credit avoided clearing in circumstances where landholders actually have a legal right to clear according to their state and territory, and they've got a history of clearing. So we try and integrate with the state and territory legal frameworks. I guess the other thing is we add another layer of complexity in Australia. We have 56 natural resource management regions, which are responsible for natural resource management planning in Australia. So trying to integrate, it's important to try and integrate our mitigation incentives and actions with those regional plans. So the regional organisations are responsible for managing these regions, and they prepare these plans, and in doing that they work with their local communities, they work with their Indigenous groups, their landholders, their agricultural organisations to sort of set local priorities and investment across the sector. Just going back to Julian's point at the beginning about sort of embracing the diversity of local priorities. So the Australian government actually put in some funding, a NRM Planning for Climate Change Fund, to help regional organisations think about how they incorporate climate change mitigation and adaptation into their regional plans. So all those plans, well, I don't know all of them, but a lot of the plans now have climate change adaptation and mitigation activities outlined. And when a project proponent under the Emissions Reduction Fund wants to apply for a project, they have to declare whether or not they're consistent with those regional plans. So I guess that's another way we're trying to, integrate our policy instruments and our financial incentives with our planning instruments in that way. I guess another challenge and another sort of focus for us is is making sure that we're just getting stakeholder consultation and involvement right from the beginning. So if we're developing a new method under the Emissions Reduction Fund, we have these technical working groups. We not only bring in the scientists who can give us the technical advice, but also we bring in the not-for-profit sector, the land care groups, industry, Indigenous Australians, all those stakeholders who might be affected by the operation of this method to get that input right from the beginning. And then we do hold more targeted workshops with our natural resource management organisations so they understand how the Emissions Reduction Fund works and they can sort of think about that in their planning. So I guess there's some of the challenges and some of the ways we've tried to tackle them.
I understand it's difficult to summarize the complexities, but thank you so much for try. Now I have a question for Estebancio.
Yes.
My question to you is, can you indicate how you've been perceived the challenges and opportunities of the engagement of Indigenous peoples in this long history of REDD+ in 1 minute?
Okay, I will try. Thank you. I think that there are difficulties and also we have opportunities, but it's all depend when we have that kind of initiative like a REDD+. I think that from the design of the project, Indigenous peoples need to be involved so they can feel that they are part of this project, and the communities can contribute with some of their Indigenous traditional knowledge and also providing the local knowledge. I think that there is opportunity for the UN agencies and the international cooperation to work with Indigenous peoples, as a case like a COICAS, a work that they are doing about the alternative REDD+.
And I think it's a very good example what COICA did, so I have to congratulate you for that. And now let's move to Kate. You already did a summary of the session almost, at least on the REDD+ issues. So my question to you, Kate, is how we could maximize the social, environmental, and other benefits that you were talking about, not to focus only on carbon, but incentivize those other benefits or incorporate them.
Thanks. So I think this has also been talked about a lot already in the presentations in terms of the different benefits and cross-cutting benefits such as water protection, biodiversity enhancement, need for stakeholder participation and respecting the rights of rights holders and Indigenous peoples. One concept that was discussed a lot in REDD and became part of some of the decisions of the Warsaw REDD framework was the concept of non-carbon benefits, which tries to capture all of these ideas and the benefits of implementing REDD that are not just the carbon results that countries need to measure and verify. Now, I think put most simply, non-carbon benefits, focusing on non-carbon benefits increases the sustainability and reduces the risk of results reversing. So to put that more simply, it makes a forest more resilient if biodiversity is enhanced. It makes a program more effective if local stakeholders are engaged from the outset, if Indigenous peoples who manage the forests in the area are given full, free, prior, informed consent and rights over their lands. All of these things increase the likelihood of results being long-lasting and sustainable. And in some of the finance funds, like in the Carbon Fund, this is actually used as a mechanism to evaluate the riskiness of results. So results with more non-carbon benefits are deemed less risky. And in terms of countries, in terms of enhancing this and how does this enhance implementation of REDD, I think focusing on, it shows the cross-cutting nature and focusing on all of these areas which often fall under other obligations countries may have in terms of reporting or funding requirements. Will enhance the moving through the readiness phase and getting towards results. And also in terms of the Cancun safeguards and the information systems countries have to build for safeguards, if that's actually premised on capturing the outcomes of all of the broad suite of non-carbon benefits, then this streamlines everything that a country has to do and is trying to do. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Usually science comes first. Now this comes the last. So my question to Daniel is, we know a lot, but how we can better, as scientists, provide inputs on how to combine practices, efforts to maximize mitigation? What will be your recommendation, Daniel?
Right. Well, as research organization, we try to make sure that we deliver at least two things. One is data. And in this kind of process, especially with the wetland I described earlier, is the emission factors and then activity data. And that's been streamlined to the IPCC processes. And I think the uncertainties is getting smaller and smaller. And secondly is the tools, and that includes this map and the way map is used. If you are interested to look at more detail about the wetland map, please come to our site event tomorrow at 4:45, and that's commercial. And that's the way we try to make sure that the research result funded by public fund is used and returned back to the community. And thirdly is the networking. And I want to underline here, with regard to wetlands, we have a huge network on the blue carbon, that's include mangrove. The IPCC has been spearheaded by Australia in Paris. And secondly is the peatland network is called GPI, the Global Peatland Initiative. Okay, as I mentioned earlier, yesterday we had a good session, and tomorrow again will be profile again how this network can help countries.
Thank you very much. So now we will open the floor for questions, or if you want to provide any answer to the questions which are being put to the panel. So first there. And there's a second question there, and a third there to start with, and a fourth there.
Thank you. Sorry. Thank you very much. Simone Lovera from Sobrevivencia, Paraguay, and Global Forest Coalition. Thank you for the interesting presentations. One of the biggest challenges we face with reducing deforestation, especially REDD+, is leakage. When deforestation rates went down in Brazil, we saw a lot of cattle ranchers basically going over the border into Paraguay, and Paraguay now faces one of the highest deforestation rates on Earth. It has been recognized in the discussion about leakage that it's actually only demand-side measures, you know, and on the consumption side of, for example, meat and dairy that can fix this through more balanced diets in importing countries of soy and beef. How does this fit within the framework of particularly REDD+? Question for any one of the panelists who could respond to this.
Let's take the 4 questions, and then the panelists can answer. Second question.
Thank you very much. Yes, my name is Paul Mafabi from Uganda, and I have 2 questions. One for a presenter from Australia on sustainability of that fund, because I know these funds always come, but the question of sustainability. And then the presenter on wetlands as to how much you have linked with the Ramsar Convention, which has a wealth of data knowledge on wetlands.
Let's move to next. Where is the mic? The next one was, can you raise the hand, please? Thailand? And Kenya. Yeah. And then this.
Okay, thank you. Very interesting presentation. I would like to pose the question to the Indonesia. You mentioned that you have reduced the deforestation up to 50% to the net deforestation. Could you elaborate more what kind of activity that for the net deforestation, you include reforestation for that too? And you mentioned that you include phi to the reference level. How you distinguish the anthropogenics and the Wi-Fi? Is it difficulty for that to just exhibit that the reference level? And for the C4 for the wetland, that you have the global peatland map, but when access to the website, it asks for the anyone could verify and edit data, how your system you provide on that? Is anyone or the governmental officer to do that? Otherwise, it's mixed up with the updating. And how update of the data in your website? Thank you.
So Kenya, please.
Thank you, Chair. Just a clarification from Indonesia. Given the significant forest cover changes arising from both deforestation and forest degradation, could you please clarify whether those two REDD+ activities are covered in your forest reference emission level?
Okay, and the final question for the first round.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Good afternoon. My name is Csaba Mojs. I'm from Hungary, from the EU country, very small country within the continent itself. And even though we are in the EU, the nature does not count EU as such. With that respect, I would like to say that, well, some of our forests are at their limit of their existence even now. And with the climate changing, we expect, we forecast that then some of our stands will somehow die out or disappear in the next, let's say, 50, 60 years. This is what our researchers told us as decision makers. With that respect, it was really interesting, all this collection of deforestation that we will also somehow expect in the near future, and the wetlands put all together. And to my mind, just combining all these two, and with the climate change, the question is, my question would be, but how to make the water to stand more on our lands. This might also help our forest somehow to overcome this thermal shock that it might face in the next decades due to the climate change. Also, our recent past provided us with the experience that in the same year we experience high flood and very high drought. Let's say within 2-3 months. My question is to the panelists, also to the scientists, and also to any other, let's say, FAO representatives, whether if they considered to put all these together somehow to retain the water also in the forest, to help our forest to survive, and not only to overcome the deforestation, but also somehow to increase the area of the forest, and also the other benefits that the forest provides to the society. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now I will give the floor to the panelists. The first question was general, so if anyone wants to answer, please go ahead. It was about how to address the leakage across the border. So, Kate, do you want to answer?
I can start, but it would be good to hear from other panelists. I think two of the things I mentioned in my presentation. So one is more of a technical sub-point, but the need for funding to be dispersed across regions. At the moment, if you look at the distribution of REDD funding, it's quite concentrated in certain countries. As are the deforestation emissions, very high in certain countries, but Simona pointed out an excellent example where they'll shift from one country to another. So support for REDD and capacity building and the efforts to address deforestation and forest degradation need to be across all forest regions. And then the second point is far more important, which is I think agriculture drives something like 70-80% of deforestation and land use change. So we really need to look beyond the forest sector and be looking at commodity supply chains, which a lot of work is happening on. But these are the sorts of, as well as demand side reduction and reduced consumption. The EU forest footprint, for example, there's been some technical work done on that showing where EU consumption drives deforestation in Brazil, Argentina, and Ghana, I think, were the 3 top countries. So that sort of work is where we have to move to be addressing this globally.
Need to run fast. So the second question was to Australia on the fund sustainability.
Thanks very much. So the Australian government committed an initial $2.55 billion to the fund. There's still a substantial amount of funds remaining for future auctions. So I think the government hasn't yet made a decision about when and how much funding will continue to go into the ERF. I think that's, I guess, really a future budget decision. But I guess I can say that the government is pretty committed to the emissions reduction fund as the centrepiece of their abatement policy, and there really are still funds available for the projects that have been contracted. Those projects are typically have 7-year contracts, and funds are given to project proponents upon delivery of the abatement. So it's not like all the money's gone out the door, in the sense that those contracts are in place, and those funds will be paid out when and where those project proponents deliver on their abatement.
Thank you very much. There was a question to Indonesia, which was quite technical in terms of what is included or not. So I encourage you to later on discuss that bilaterally. It was some questions on wetlands to C4. First, on the link, if it's linkages with the Ramsar Convention, and the second one was in terms of the accessibility, the update, and who will verify the information which is in the web.
Okay, well, thank you, Uganda. I think Ramsar Convention is one of the founding member of GPI. I think they will bring all these issues of Ramsar sites and member countries, and I believe they will drive the process in the GPI. And GPI still invites countries and members to join as we speak. They have not closed the door yet. So look up the website, and if you think your countries are, eligible or appropriate to be part of this, that will be a kind of move. On the wetland map, if someone is going to use it and try to verify the map and contribute the data, the only requirement is that one can be individual or countries or parties or national focal point should register on that, just to make sure that we have the record who is visiting the map and what is going to be used and how can we follow this up. So very simple.
And then it was a question on adaptation. I mean, how to combine adaptation and mitigation. And it was very interesting that it was coming from a developed country, from Hungary. So it will be very interesting to see the views of the panel on that. We've seen that almost every single panelist mentioned multiple objectives in the land sector, and I think everyone had in mind adaptation as well as mitigation. So you want to add anything on that to highlight any further message on that?
I guess this probably harks back a little bit more to the agriculture, Tem, but some of the work we're doing under the Emissions Reduction Fund in agriculture are having both adaptation and mitigation benefits. So we have a method for building soil carbon in grazing lands. This is improving soil health. It's improving the general profitability and resilience of those farms. So I guess that's where we're really seeing win-wins in adaptation and mitigation in some of those incentives in the agricultural sector.
Or Ibu, you want to say something on that? And I think Daniel wants to say something as well.
Just Hungary asked also how to make water stay in land and prevent from high flood and high draw. Of course, there is to keep carbon, or to increase the carbon content in soil, for example, by agroforestry. And at some point, there can be also some places identified and some forests that have to stay in forest to prevent some flood also. There are several mechanisms that can be...
Yes, Daniel.
Yeah, you mentioned about wetland in Hungary. I think one of the main message that we learned yesterday. You can, when you protect wetland, it doesn't mean that you don't have to touch it. You can do something in wetland while it's wet. That's the message we learn. And when it is wet, it can be used for mitigation because the emission will be reduced, oxidation will be reduced, and at the same time, it's also reduce the risk of fire. And in tropical situation, rewetting peatland has been a very big activities nowadays. And if you don't get carbon there, you will adapt to the increasing temperature and warming climate, and certainly will adapt to the fire occurrence. And in coastal wetland, if you don't count the carbon which is accumulating in mangrove sites, for example, the ecosystem really is building land with a rate of higher than the increase of sea level. So you can see the double side of a coin here, adaptation and mitigation, while you're doing restoration and conservation.
Thank you, Daniel. I think we don't have more time unless there is a very burning question from the floor from someone. We don't have a time to really wrap up in length, but I want to mention several words that I think were very important in the discussion. One is that different countries are in different stages, and this includes developed countries and developing countries, and this leads to different sorts of challenges. So it's also an evolution in the challenges. In the case of REDD countries, REDD+ countries, they are transitioning from one phase to another, and this implies different types of support needed. And unless this support is provided, this transition won't happen at the speed that we may expect. Engagement of stakeholders is being mentioned by all. Multiple objectives is being mentioned by all. Obvious relation between mitigation and adaptation at the level of implementation on the ground is very important for successful actions to be unfold. And I think also it was mentioned that the science is always there to back up the sort of evolving needs. And particularly there are still gaps on things that we may thought were solved, like monitoring degradation, for example, which was mentioned by Colombia. Having said that, I think that there is a lot of things to learn from each other. There is a lot of information provided by Australia and France, for example, on the details on how they are domestically implementing and trying to provide the institutional arrangements, which they are still sometimes, working on it. While developing countries are still on the design phase, and they are still facing basic challenges, like, for example, how to find the finance for investments, which is, I think, a big challenge for most of the countries, which is shown by the fact that few countries are showing results already in the last decade. And many countries are starting to really move forward. And it was mentioned that 25 countries submitted reference levels, which is a huge effort, an unprecedented effort to provide information that has to be recognized, but there are still challenges on how to improve this information and move forward. And I think that's a message for everyone, and support the balance across regions. But I think more exchange will really benefit everyone in these discussions. So I hope my poor summary sort of summarized a little bit the rich discussion, and I desire you a very nice evening. Thank you so much.